Okay, you guys. So I'm going to try something a little new today and record my audio on my computer. We'll see if this sounds a little better. I know sometimes the complaint I get is that I'm a little too quiet, so hopefully this will help the audio be a little bit sharper. Let me know if you guys notice the difference. So today we are going to be in Jonah Chapter 2. If you didn't watch the first video, I will link to that down below and you can watch that first. It'll all make a little more sense if you read this as a whole. Again, I am in my She Reads Truth Bible, so this is the Christian Standard Bible. It is a little bit more in plain English, but please keep in mind it's so important to read your Bible in different versions because it really gives you a fuller picture of the different translations. So I always try to read it in at least 3 texts. I really enjoy just plain reading my Bible in this version because it's very easy to understand. But the New King James Version is a little bit easier to study in, and then the English Standard Version is a good place to start as well, if you need something that's a little easier to read. Okay, so this is Jonah's prayer from inside of the fish's stomach, and like I talked about in the last video, keep in mind whether you believe that this part is true or not is kind of irrelevant to the story. This is a story about God and His grace and His mercy. So just keep that at the forefront. I will talk a little bit about, kind of the historical context of this, and I believe that this is a historical account. So my notes are going to reflect that. But again, the Bible is very, personal, and I think that there's a lot of debate about this anyway. So kind of take that with a grain of salt. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read through Jonah's prayer first so that you can get a full idea, and then we will go into marking this up. Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish. I called to the Lord my distress, and he answered me. I cried out for help from deep inside Sheol. You heard my voice. You threw me into the depths, into the heart of the sea, and the current overcame me. All of your breakers and your billows swept over me. But I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look once more towards your holy temple. The water engulfed me up to the neck, and the watery depths overcame me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. I sank to the foundations of the mountains. The earth's gate shut behind me forever. Then you raised my life from the pit, Lord my God. As my life was fading away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you, to your holy temple. Those who cherish worthless idols abandon their faithful love. But as for me, I will sacrifice to you with a voice of thanksgiving. I will fulfill what I have vowed. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Then the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto the dry land. Okay, so this is a short little chapter that we're going to go through today, so this will be fairly quick, but this is really leading up to chapter 3, which we will go a little more in depth with. Okay, so in verse 1, we see that finally Jonah is kind of forced to stop running. He has to step before God, and then we see verse 2 through 9 is his prayer to God. So I'm just going to say here, Jonah is forced to slow down. And I think this is so relevant to our lives, you guys. A lot of times it takes a horrible thing to happen for us to really slow down and refocus our eyes on God. Sometimes that is, a weekend away from life and just the busyness, taking a vacation. Sometimes that's, doing something through the church, taking some time to volunteer, or maybe just going to church on a Sunday, just stopping your regular life and carving time out for God. And you can do this at any time in your life. You don't have to, be sitting in the fish's belly to pray to God. But sometimes just stopping and just really pausing to come before the Lord is what we really need to refocus and to resort what our priorities are. So Jonah kind of gets forced into doing this here. And we see his prayer. So there are some important words I want to pull up from verse 2. The first one is a Sheol, which I think I'm mispronouncing, but I have a hard time pronouncing words, so we're going to go with that. What this means is the grave, or oftentimes the realm of the dead. This is really used a lot in the Old Testament to just mean someone's dead or that they're facing death. And so when we see this, he says, I cried out for help from deep inside Sheol, or the grave. So this is kind of a metaphor here, that we see this fish is kind of a metaphorical tomb. And what this is pointing to is Jesus' death and resurrection. And we see this a lot in the Old Testament, these kind of, little verses that point to Jesus in some way, and that's what this is. So we're going to write next to this tomb, so that way we remember that this is how Jonah feels. He feels as though his life has paused. He has died. And this is going to point to Matthew 12:40. My handwriting's a little crazy right now, you guys. I drank a big cup of coffee before this, so I'm all shaky. I apologize. Not great timing. So the important thing to pull out of verse 2 here is that even though Jonah here is in a sort of tomb, God hears his prayers. So even facing death, God is with us. I'm going to go ahead and just write that here. And by the way, you guys, you can use color in your Bibles. I did that a lot in my older videos if you're curious of what that looks like. Personally, I just really like the look of just black and white. And so a lot of this Bible is going to be mostly black and white, especially because these pages are so thin. The colors will show through. In case you're curious, I'm using the Pilot G2 in 0.38. And that doesn't bleed through. It definitely shadows, and if I write too hard, it'll bleed through a bit. But for the most part, this is the pen that kind of works the best in here. So if you are using the same Bible as me, just keep that in mind. You're free to use whatever tools you want, but do expect some shadowing and some bleed through because these pages are very, very thin. Okay, so let's move on to verse 3 through kind of verse 5, and I'm going to be flipping back and forth here, so just be prepared. Verses 3 and 5 show Jonah's belief that he was going to die, and it's kind of interesting how, the book of Jonah is literally, I'm having a rough time. It is written very beautifully. It's written purposefully and using a lot of literary elements. One of these we see is sort of the symmetry. So in verse 3, we see kind of a hopelessness and death. And in verse 4, we see some hope. And in verse 5, we see that hopelessness again. And it's to show, using this kind of format that God is with us even amongst hopelessness. Even when we're in between a rock and a hard place, there is hope there. And so as you read through this, kind of pay attention to that, the way that the symmetry works. Even in chapter 1 and chapter 3, we see symmetry. And in chapter 2 and chapter 4, we see symmetry. This book is beautifully written. So we see here, you threw me into the depths and the hearts of the sea, and the current overcame me. All of your breakers and your billows swept over me. A lot of times, especially as kids, we kind of get that VeggieTale effect, where in VeggieTales, Jonah jumps over the side of the boat and he's immediately eaten by the fish. And we can tell from his prayer here in this kind of poem that that's not really what happened. More than likely, Jonah probably floated down to the bottom of the sea. And we see that here in verse 5. The water engulfed me up to the neck. The watery depths overcame me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. Jonah was, he is facing death here. He was sinking to the bottom of the ocean. He could not breathe. He was about to die when the fish came and took him. And so we see God finding this mercy kind of amongst this pain and this fear. I mean, imagine drowning. That is some intense fear that is going on in Jonah's world. And even amongst that, he finds God. He prays and he looks towards God in this moment of fear. And so, even among his death, that was certain and terrifying. Among all of that fear, we see in verse 4 that Jonah was looking towards the holy temple. And what that kind of means, more in literary terms than, you kind of have to read between the lines here. But Jonah expected that he might have the chance to live again, that he might have the chance to, look toward the Holy Temple, which is Israel or Jerusalem. And so we see this hope amongst this certain death. And then here we'll put wrapped around my head, depths overcame me, up to my neck. All of these are pointing towards fear and certain death. Okay, let's look in verse 6. I sank to the foundation of the mountains, and the earth's gates shut behind me forever. Then you raised me from the pit, Lord my God. And keep in mind, we talked about this a bit earlier, but anytime you see the Lord in all capital letters, that is God's personal name. From the original translation, they use Lord in all capitals, but that is literally Yahweh. So he's addressing him as a personal God, not just, hey God, thanks for saving me, but it's a personal conversation with someone that he has built this relationship with. So keep that in mind as you read throughout Jonah as well, because we'll get to that in chapter 3 a little more, kind of the difference between the two. So these mountains were most likely imagery from Israel's Mount Carmel. Yeah, is it Carmel? I'm pronouncing that wrong. Carmel. That's probably what it is. But these mountain bases extend deep into the Mediterranean Sea, and so that's most likely the reference here. And just as Jonah felt his life ending, we see God raising him from the pit. And a lot of times, the earth's gates and the pit, that's referencing a sort of underworld. And so this is showing that Jonah was literally, looking in the face of death when God raised him. And so we see, you raised my life from the pit. Again, this is pointing to Jesus' resurrection. And this shows, that God can overcome death. He is in control of life and death here. And that, again, this is an example of a miracle, which is part of the reason that I believe this is historical context. If God can save Jonah from the depths and from death, I believe that he could do that using a fish. And again, we see the personal God, Yahweh, being used here. Okay, verse 7. As my life was fading away, I remembered the Lord, again, Lord, all capitals, and my prayer came to you, to your holy temple. So this verse refers to a Thanksgiving song in Psalm 18:30. So we'll quickly flip over to that. I'll write this down real quick. And there's a lot of psalms that refer to Thanksgiving and things like that. But you'll notice a lot in the Old Testament and the New Testament, people referring to these psalms. Okay, so Psalm 18:30. God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord is pure. He is a shield to all who take refuge in him. So we see among, as Jonah is sinking down and he is about to die, God saves him and he prays to the Lord a psalm. He looks towards his holy temple. So Jonah is telling the story of these answered prayers. He's saying, God fulfills his promises. He answers prayers. And we also see this in Jonah 2:2. Again, we see a lot of repetition in this poem, in this prayer. He says, I called to the Lord in my distress, and he answered me. So we see that, God is a God who answers prayers. And he also fulfills his promises. Okay. So verse 8 through 9 kind of go hand in hand here. Those who cherish worthless idols, this is referring to the pagans, abandon their faithful love. But as for me, I will sacrifice to you with a voice of thanksgiving. I will fulfill what I have vowed. Salvation belongs to the Lord. And that word salvation can also mean deliverance. They kind of go hand in hand as well. So, unlike the pagan idols that we see we see God's deliverance here. We see him fulfilling his promises. And when Jonah says, fulfill what I have vowed, what that means is it basically refers to a promised gift to God, that if he should answer Jonah's prayer, Jonah is vowing a gift towards him. And we see this a lot in the Old Testament. One of the examples I found was in Numbers 21:2. So I'm going to flip to that real quick and we'll look at that. Sorry, you guys. Again, these pages are so thin, they're kind of hard to flip around. Okay. So 21:2. Then Israel made a vow to the Lord. If you will hand these people over to us, we will completely destroy their cities. The Lord listened to Israel's request and handed the Canaanites over to them. So we see that these people, when we see Jonah making a vow, he is vowing that because God has saved him, that he will obey or he will fulfill a promise. So, kind of following that, we see that he makes an offering. Salvation belongs to the Lord. And kind of this offering of fellowship is used to worship God or kind of seal the vow. And again, you can see this in Numbers. We'll go to Numbers 6:21. These are the instructions about the Nazarite who vows his offering to the Lord for his consecration. In addition to whatever else he can afford, he must fulfill whatever vow he makes in keeping with the instructions for his consecration. Sorry, you guys, I'm having a hard time with that word. You guys can read that, yeah? So the idea here is that he is making a vow and then he seals that vow by making this promise. So Jonah vows or promises to offer the Lord his obedience. So because Jonah has been saved by God, he understands the purpose that he has been saved, and he promises that he will, salvation belongs to the Lord. He will do all things that the Lord commands. He will obey him. And so in verse 10, we see that God releases Jonah to fulfill that command and to fulfill that vow. And after 3 days, again, pointing to the resurrection, the fish vomits Jonah onto dry land. And now it's left up to Jonah to either fulfill his vow, and he can obey God and go to Nineveh, or he can run away, like we saw in chapter 1. So, as usual, we are free humans. We have free will. God is giving Jonah another chance. So Jonah is given another chance to obey God. And we will pick that up in chapter 3 next week.